From what I know, death and taxes comes from a saying. There are only two things certain in life: death and taxes. And in Magic it translates to basically there's always going to be White Weenie, because I think the death and taxes name just caught on because White Weenie was played in all the formats at all points, in limited, constructed, standard, modern, vintage, always was White Weenie, and it survived to this day. The deck has evolved, but it's still white creatures that are not that impressive at the first look, but they work well together.
Wherever the deck's name came from, one thing is for certain. Death and Taxes has and will always be a formidable deck in Magic's deepest format, Legacy. But how did this deck come to be? What cards allowed it to transition from a fringe deck to one of Legacy's best meta decks? How does a deck even win? All of that will be explained as we interview some of Magic's best Death and Taxes players about this one-of-a-kind deck.
So the goal of a White Weenie deck is generally to try to play out a bunch of cost-efficient creatures and kill your opponent quickly. It'll generally play cards like Dryad Militant, Soldier of the Pantheon, the sort of Savannah Lions of yesteryear, and your goal is to just kill your opponent as fast as possible with these efficient creatures. Death and Taxes is more about disrupting what your opponent is doing. A card like Phyrexian Revoker, that's not a cost-efficient creature these days. It's a 2/1 for 2, but it's able to mess up a lot of your opponent's plans by locking out their specific permanents that they rely on, while you sort of gradually kill them and keep their mana locked down with Port and Wasteland.
It's a prison deck, disguised as a White Weenie deck. You're trying to prevent your opponent from doing anything relevant, and every card in your deck is basically just setting up a board state where their cards don't matter, and they eventually lose to some random creature that has power and toughness.
People think of White Weenie as like this narrow thing where it's just Crusades and Brave the Elements and a bunch of Savannah Lions. But I mean, that's sort of the basic White Weenie deck, but there's a lot of things that, especially with all the new cards that are being printed, where all the white creatures have abilities. I mean, you have Stoneforge Mystic, you have like Mother of Runes, you have all these creatures that are disruptive, and they're just the best White Weenie creatures. I mean, this is a White Weenie deck. It's just a White Weenie deck with a lot more options that can play as a control deck. Because Legacy's weird, everyone has a low curve, so even the control decks are a low curve.
I think explaining the concept of Death and Taxes is quite difficult because you do so many different things, and once you tell it to a person who wouldn't play Legacy ever and you explain him the deck, he would be like, that's a pile of cards. How does this win? But in the end it does, but it's also very hard to play. So.
Death and Taxes has existed since the release of Time Spiral back in late 2006, early 2007, and finally rose to prominence in 2013 when the deck won its first Grand Prix title.
And that's it! Enevoldsen takes home the title for Denmark, winning a WMCQ and then winning a GP. We see huge roar from everyone in the crowd.
The Death and Taxes deck has been around for a really long time. I think it existed before I started playing Legacy. I think the originator was Finn on the Source, and I think the deck first started coming up when the Mangara was printed and the Mangara-Karakas interaction was first noticed. That was the big selling point on the deck. As far as I know, it was a tier 2, sort of fringe deck for a long time. And then when Thali was printed, I think that was what sort of put it over the edge into the top tier of decks, when it had a 2-drop creature that worked decently well with Karakas and shut down a lot of the issues the deck had.
There are probably many stories as to where it originated. I learned about it from 2 friends I was playing Legacy with at my local store, and I found out from forum boards and stuff that other people had also come up with it, and then sort of got inspiration from there.
I know that you've been running Death and Taxes for a very long time.
For a very long time.
You're the main proponent of the deck.
Takes practice.
It does take practice, yes. And it paid off.
Yes, finally.
So, how does it take your pet deck to the win at a Grand Prix?
No one truly knows who created the first ever Death and Taxes deck or who named it originally, but we do know how it wins.
It wins by attacking with creatures, and so it has Flicker Wisp and Sarah Avenger, and it also just has the Batterskull combo with Stoneforge. So a lot of times you just trade resources with the opponent until you can establish a window where you can just start attacking for 3 every turn with Sarah Avenger. And in Legacy, a lot of times the opponent deals, a whole bunch of damage to themselves. So when we're talking about attacking for 3 in the air, it might just be 4 hits.
The general routes to victory: you can either Wasteland and Enrich and Import all of their lands. You can play Thalia when their deck is bad against Thalia. You can get a Stoneforge Mystic into play and get a Batterskull or a Jite, and that kills them. Or there's the slow, miserable death to a Mother of Runes you can never answer, backing a random creature that has stats like a Flicker Wisp or a Mirror Crusader. Well, you kind of sit there and just don't have anything that matters. The gist is that no matter how you win, your opponent stops playing Magic and has to sit around and wait for you.
You're not really sort of trying to rush down your opponent. Your goal is really to control the pace of the game and restrict what they're able to do more than just trying to kill them as fast as possible. There's a lot of games where you'll actually just sit and not play creatures in your hand because it's better to use your Rashad and Ports to keep their mana tied up and things like that.
Well, the beautiful thing about the Death and Taxes deck is that it is both an aggro deck and a control deck. Thalia in particular is sort of a control card in the way that it counters spells in the sense that it prevents them from being cast. But at the same time, it's a 2/1 for 2, so it'll get on the board early and it'll start attacking. So it's both an aggro deck, and you can have draws that are very aggressive. You can have like Thalia and a Mirror Crusader and a Mother of Runes, and suddenly you're a very aggressive deck. Or you can have a slower one with Stoneforge Mystic, where you get a Batterskull into play and you're trying to block maybe more. So in that sense, the beautiful thing about the deck is that it can both play offense and defense very well.
Because it attacks you from so many different angles that it's very hard to cover them all. So even though I don't think Death and Taxes is a deck that can be successful for a long time, it can have its right moments in the metagame once you adjust the deck to what you expect to play against.
What makes this deck so powerful?
What makes this deck so powerful? First of all, is it that nobody thinks it's powerful. That's the first thing that makes it powerful.
A lot of players will argue that Death and Taxes is not one of Legacy's best decks because it only wins when the metagame least expects it. This is true, but it's also one of the reasons why Death and Taxes will always be a viable deck.
I think a big part of the reason that it's successful is because it's a solid, strong deck. I imagine it will probably ebb and flow with, just like any deck in Legacy, depending on how people start trying to beat it.
On one hand, there's more and more cards printed every year, and which makes a lot of decks better. But from time to time, there's just this one creature every second or third set we're like, this could go into the Death and Taxes deck. So I think it'll stay on for a while still, and I think it'll be fine, but it's never been that popular of a deck, so I think it's going to have to rely on the beacons of hope to keep going.
It has a lot of just free wins. It has like a lot of weird things that are very hard to beat for a lot of decks. Like Mirror Crusader is almost unbeatable for a lot of decks. And Mangara Karakas is almost unbeatable for a lot of decks, and Stoneforge is almost unbeatable for a lot of decks. Sometimes you have to work for them to not do anything for the rest of the game, but sometimes you're just like, wasteland you, I have an Aether Vial in play, I get to play all my spells and you do nothing.
It makes me feel smart to play it, because you're winning with cards that on the surface looks underwhelming compared to the rest of the Legacy format. It sort of makes you feel clever that you have to outsmart your opponent to win usually, and so when you win, it's because you've sort of done something clever, and I like that about Magic.